So thank you for joining us on the Sports Vision Pros Defocus Media podcast. At Sports Vision Pros, we're passionate about connecting the worlds of sports and vision. Doctors Fraser Horn, Derek Cunningham, Amanda Nancy, and Keith Smithson have partnered with the industry leader in optometric podcast, Defocus Media, to bring you an exciting educational series discussing a range of topics from sports eyewear, contact lenses, refractive surgery, sports nutrition, visual performance enhancement, concussion management, just to name a few. We'll be joined by some very special guests to help detail the visual needs of athletes, pilots, law enforcement and military members, first responders, and many more. Sit back, enjoy, learn how to not just meet the needs, but improve the visual performance of the athletes you'll encounter every day.
Greetings, esteemed colleagues, and welcome to the Sports Vision Pros podcast. Today, I'm super excited because we have some amazing guests. We're going to go from riding motorcycles or motocross to flying planes with pilots. We're going to talk about everything because when it comes to vision, our vision is dynamic. So we have to have the right tools and resources to make sure that our patients can see well, but most importantly, function at a high level. Today, it's only right that I share this stage with these amazing colleagues of mine, Dr. Keith Smithson and Dr. Derek Cunningham, who are important players over at Sports Vision Pros. But before we get started, gentlemen, please share a little bit about your background.
Yeah, thanks for having us, Darryl. We're excited for this podcast series. It's going to be something ongoing for a long time. We're really excited about bringing the world of sports and vision together. That's what we're all about at Sports Vision Pros, connecting the worlds of sports and vision and the many aspects that includes. So I'm myself outside of Washington, D.C. I work with 7 professional sports teams in the D.C. market, from the NFL, NBA, NHL, Major League Soccer, Major League Baseball. So I have an opportunity to work with a lot of amazing athletes and share some of those life lessons and vision lessons with our crowd.
I love it. Dr. Cunningham, the man of the hour. What's up, my friend? Tell us a little bit about yourself.
All right. So coming to you from Austin, Texas. And again, at Sports Vision Pros, we think outside of the box as well. So I do obviously a lot with the University of Texas, but we do a lot with government contracts like tactical fighters, the guys who do first responders type stuff, special forces. We also have a history of working with pilots as well. So that's what's really cool about what we're going to do here. We're going to talk about some of my passions, which is motorcycle racing, and my other passion, which is flying and specifically, working with fighter pilots. And we have some of the leading experts in those fields in the country, maybe the world, coming to join us. And that's super cool for me today.
I love it. Now I want to give a special shout out to Bausch Lomb for partnering with Sports Vision Pros on this podcast. It's partners like Bausch Lomb that help to elevate eye care and bring real stories, real conversations to help patients live their best lives. Now, gentlemen, I'm very excited because you always bring these rock star ODs or guests on the show. And today we're going to bring on a gentleman that is all about motocross, all about vision, all about working with elite athletes. And I'm super excited. Friends and family, we'd like to welcome Dr. Edmunds to the show today. How are you doing, Dr. Edmunds?
I'm excellent, Darryl. It's really happy to be here. Derek, Keith, and I go back an awful long time. So it's we have so many common interests, which is really cool. I mean, Derek and I are ripping around on motorcycles, and we're all so passionate about optimizing visual performance, this niche, this special subspecialty of eye care, sports vision, that it's anytime we get a chance to chat up about this is a great day.
I love it. Well, we're going to kick off the show now. We're going to start off talking about motorcycles and riding bikes and dynamic vision. And then later on in the show, we're going to jump into how to fly in the sky and how to correct pilots' vision and make sure that they're seeing well to function at a high level as well. But my friend, Dr. Edmunds, you got to share a little bit more about your background, man, because you've done so much in the industry and done so much for eyewear or eye care. So I'm really excited to dive a little deeper, and then we're going to get this party started, my friend.
Sounds good. So full disclosure, I'm an old guy. Okay. I graduated optometry school in 1984. And so I've been around a while. I had an 18-year career with Bausch Lomb, actually traveling around the world, 75 countries, having a great time. I was involved in their when they were the worldwide Olympic sponsors back in 92. I established the Bausch Lomb Olympic Vision Center, which was the first international program which actually captured the visual performance of these Olympic level athletes. And that's where I got the bug about sports vision. And so when I left the corporation at the end of '05, I established a sports vision only clinic outside of Rochester, New York here. And I've been having a go at this, this whole time and building a sports vision only business and having a great time working at it too. As you mentioned, I've worked with a lot of extreme sport athletes it's really critical. Visual skills are absolutely critical. So what I tell people in extreme sports, if you don't see that well, if you don't make a proper judgment, the consequences can be pretty severe. So we really have to make sure that our clients are up to snuff on everything.
I love that. And what I really want to do next is really paint the picture of what it looks like for this extreme sports, the extreme vision. Kind of paint that picture if you don't mind, because I think that's going to set the foundation for this conversation moving forward today.
Sure. So if we do what's called a visual task analysis, it kind of is our objective way to look at the challenges that our athletes have before them. And so, for example, some of the extreme sports that I deal with, motocross, let's say, freestyle BMX, I work with some Olympic freestyle skiers, etc. You're moving constantly, quickly. Your body is twisting, turning, getting thrown, this way and that. And you instantly have to make some decisions with regard to judgment of speed, depth, trajectory, and then also identify obstacles and challenges and neutralize those. And so, it's one thing to, one of the things that we have to do, certainly as optometrists, is optimize those pillars, those foundations of visual performance, visual acuity, contrast, sensitivity. But then we can work on the how well the eyes are working together, and then how well we're processing that to create a motor response here. So, you could just imagine ripping around a motocross track. You've got, double jumps, triple jumps. You have to, accurately gauge the distance, the depth. You have to make sure that you're in the right groove. Okay, these tracks get all beat up, and each time you go around a lap, it's a new thing. So you're constantly recalculating, reprogramming, and adjusting. So it's things are really happening dynamic. That's one of my favorite visual skills is dynamic visual acuity and dynamic stereopsis, being able to judge distance, depth, speed, etc. in motion. And so there's an awful lot of things to think about, and there's a lot of places areas where we as optometrists can play.
And we have two experts on the call that love to play on this playground. So Derek, I'm curious to know, I understand that you like to get out on bikes and ride and do all types of wild things. So let's break this down a little bit more from your perspective and talk about maybe some challenges that patients face when it comes to this. Because when I'm hearing this, I'm thinking about astigmatism. I'm thinking about presbyopes. And I'm like, man, this is a lot to take on to help manage a patient and find the right vision solution. So I'd be curious to know, your personal perspective and how you tackle these two hurdles that are in front of us when it comes to patient care.
Well, yeah, it's really interesting that you touched on those two things, because realistically with our patient base, a lot of our patients don't really explore a lot of, I would say, higher level extreme activities until they have the means to do so, meaning, more presbyopes are actually spending the money to do some of this crazy stuff. So that does play a lot into what we do. It's not what you think. Most of my extreme athletes don't have the money to be extreme athletes until, they're later on in life. And the second thing is exactly like you said, the first time, and Fred, you can probably echo this like crazy, but the first time I ever got on a MotoGP style or like racing motorcycle, you realize very quickly that 99% of your time, you're looking straight up through your brow. All right. So basically imagine getting on all fours and trying to look up as high as you can at extreme right and extreme left. And they are doing this for an hour solid. They never get in primary gaze. And so it really got us thinking about where we're going to check these guys' vision and how we're going to check their vision. Because I don't really care in the exam lane when they're looking straight at me what their vision is. I need to know what their vision is when they're looking up through their brow. And for extreme periods of time with incredible fatigue setting in. So it's kind of these things that also the low hanging fruit was, gosh, well, how does a contact lens going to fit when they're not looking straight ahead. And Fred, you got 10 times worse. You got people that are flipping through the air, at least with, some of these motorsport people. They may just be looking at one extreme angle, but it's typically pretty defined. So when I literally check a motorcycle racer, I am getting them in the slit lamp and I'm checking the rotation of the lens at an extreme up gaze. And that sounds crazy, but that's how they see the whole time. And it's one of these things that I rely heavily on some of these two guys, Fred and Keith. I ask them questions all the time. I'm always learning about contact lenses. I don't have the experience that these guys have, but this concept of what makes these lenses do what they do and how do they do it? And, what makes a better lens for this situation versus that situation? Fred, how much thought goes into the type of lens you're going to fit depending on the sport?
Quite a bit, actually, Derek. You hit it right on the head. So critical is obviously the orientation of a soft toric lens and its rotational stability. But like you said, you have to challenge that. You have to put them in different head positions, left and right. And then the other thing that we haven't even mentioned yet is what happens over time. The eyes get dry. And if you've got some angle, some interruption with the proper rotation, and those eyes get dry, now you don't have that lens coming back into its proper orientation. And so I kind of have a cutoff of, and when I'm considering somebody, I have kind of in the back of my mind, I have a cutoff. How much astigmatism am I going to be comfortable with a certain type of soft toric contact lens? And if it's a significant amount of astigmatism, and I see some rotational instability of a particular toric lens design, I'm going to try either a different soft toric lens design, or I'm going to punt and I'm going to go to scleral. Okay. So these are, and it's a lot of fun to think about these things too, because it's not just your typical boring toric lens fit, or, am I going to fit this half a diopter cylinder at 40 with a spherical equivalent lens, or am I going to go after that cylinder correction, for example? So yeah, I'm constantly thinking these things. And again, I do have in the back of my mind, I've got a bit of a cutoff. How much astigmatism am I going to be comfortable fitting with certain designs and certain lens types before I consider going to something different?
All right. Well,
Yeah,
Keith,
that's such a great conversation, and honestly, it's one of those things that I don't personally live in the extreme sport world like these two gentlemen, Darryl. But one of the things that I always kind of advocate for our colleagues out there that are listening to this podcast and people that we come in contact with every day is that if you're not the expert in the sport, ask about it, right? So you may be the expert from a visual standpoint and correction and visual performance, but ask. If you're dealing with a motocross racer for the first time, or a BMX competitor, or as we're going to talk about later, a pilot. What are their needs? What are their directions of gaze? What are their head positions? What are the lighting conditions that they're under? And we talked a little bit about dryness there. How long are their competitions? Do they run, a 20-minute track, or are they on the track for 2 hours? I think that's a big difference as well. Because putting that equation together of the perfect, let's say, contact lens fit, since we've been talking about contact so far, it's not just about having that perfect clarity 2015, 2010 in primary gaze for 30 seconds, right? It's about coming up with the combination of the best contact lens comfort, the best vision, and the best performance, right? So it's kind of those three variables that you have to check the box of. You may have a lens that in primary gaze gives you better clarity than another, but it doesn't perform over the long run and stay stable over an hour long of competition. So you have to kind of vary those different scales and make sure that you have the right solution for that athlete. And again, if you don't know their environment, I think you have to ask about it. It's just really, really critical to understand what they're going to experience so that you can prescribe the right solution for them, right?
Well, Keith, here's a question I've literally asked you before. Can you just run down for us the difference between some of the toric lenses conceptually and what you look for in a toric? Like what makes you, because a lot of times I'll call you and I say, listen, I need a toric lens for this football player. And, these are his base parameters. And you're like, oh, go with this lens. What makes you think that way about certain lenses versus others?
Yeah, I mean, so there's a couple things, and Fred touched on it there too, as far as having a bar as to where your level of toricity is. So the first question is, do you actually need a toric lens, right? So, we talk a lot about spherical contact lenses, and what that means to, someone who's not a practitioner on this call and on this podcast is, a contact lens that's basically round, right? So a basketball shaped contact lens. So, that's the easy one to fit. It can rotate around like a clock dial. It's always consistent vision and consistent performance. But, when you add this, this not spherical shaped eye, you have an eye that has an astigmatic component. Now you're dealing with a level of distortion. The question is, how significant is that distortion based on the athlete's environment as to whether or not it needs to be corrected? And so let's say it's not a perfectly round cornea, but it's slightly oval shaped, right? So you have a little bit of toricity. In that case, it might be fine to have what we call an aspheric contact lens, which is something that kind of provides a bit more HD, higher definition kind of optics, but it covers sort of low amounts of astigmatism without correcting astigmatism. So if you have someone who has a high prescription, there may be a -5, -6 nearsighted myope with 75 still. They have a little astigmatic component. They may really appreciate those aspheric optics and be going into a lens like the BioTrue family we talked about with Bausch Lomb, the BioTrue 1-days, the Infuse spherical lenses or aspheric contact lenses. They do a great job at creating a higher definition kind of optic when you have the ratio of nearsightedness to astigmatism being much heavier on the nearsighted realm, right? But to Fred's point, if the toricity is really critical and if it needs to be corrected, now you're dealing with the performance of the contact lens. So maybe we're thinking about monthly disposability versus daily disposability. Is it going to be a fresh new lens every day and have consistent performance? What's the stabilizing mechanism for that toric lens? There's a lot of lenses that are what we call prism ballasted lens. They're essentially thicker, weighted kind of at the bottom. And I always tell the patients it's kind of like a pendulum. So it'll kind of swing down to the bottom. And once it sits there, if it fits well, it should sit there. Now we talk about going in different head position. If you're rolling your head to the right, is that lens going to move to the right and now shift a little bit of what your expectation was? That's something, to Derek's point, you have to look at behind the slit lamp and see. But if that's not a right fit for them, other lenses out there are built with, a sort of a double thin zone, they call it. So they essentially take the contact lens and shave the top and bottom of the contact lens to be thinner than the edges. And that stabilizing mechanism is essentially using the eyelids to kind of rotate and find stability, because the eyelids shouldn't go anywhere. So we should have some stability in that case. So if you have a contact lens that's not fitting well, there are options. And you do have to think about, I think, all those pieces of the puzzle to find the right solution for them, especially when we're talking about contact lenses. You think, Fred?
Yeah, Keith, and I totally agree. And everything you said is spot on. So during my career with Bausch Lomb, I did a lot of work with toric lenses. I love toric lenses. Okay, so I know a little bit about them. And where we were, 20 years ago versus where we are now is light years. Okay, so lenses generally are much more predictable in terms of their rotational stability, in terms of where they're going to end up in their rotation, et cetera. But that said, there are differences in the design, and they will fit differently. They will stabilize differently depending on what the sport is. And so what I quite often I'll do is I'll dispense that client with a couple different lens designs. One might not work. One might work a lot better than the other. So they may leave the office with 2 or 3 different, or maybe sometimes 4 different lens designs. And I basically tell them, you're going to wear this design 2 different days or twice in a row, doing your sport, doing your activity. Then you're going to wear the other one 2 days in a row, doing your sport, doing your activity. And you're going to gauge, you're actually going to evaluate them, try to be as objective as possible in terms of, comfort, dryness, visual stability, okay, visual, constant, visual acuity, etc. And you explain it to them, help them out, and they have some fun with it. They create a 10-point scale and rate them. Okay, you're going to come up with a winner, and that's because we, and Derek, you talked about this earlier. You try to have somebody, you try to mimic the position of gaze where their head's going to be. Okay, it's going to be all over the place unless there are certain sports like bicycle racing, for example, and road bike racing where you are like this and you're quite a different position of gaze. But there's a lot of sports where there's all these different positions of gaze. We're not going to be able to replicate that in our practice, and so that's why I'm like, and I don't live with this person, so I'm like, here you go. Here's a bunch of lenses. Give them a go. Here's how I want you to evaluate them, and let them figure out what the best solution is. Essentially, so. Yeah, this is really interesting. It's so much more fun to jump into this and think of this, analytically than just doing, soft toric lenses because I got a diopter and a half a cylinder. Wow, here you go. Here's another one, and this is inexpensive, et cetera. This takes it to the next level, and it's a lot of fun to think this way. And the patients really, really appreciate it. So that's another thing that I'll say too is talk it through, explain what it is that you're doing, why you're having them do this. Okay, make them an ally in their own care, and it makes it fun for them too.
Yeah, and I think you touched on a really critical point there too, is the technology of the material itself, right? So all contact lenses are not made equally, and there's not necessarily a perfect contact lens, right? So I always tell the athlete it's about the perfect lens for them, right? So sometimes it's the polymer that the lens is made of. Is it a basic hydrogel plastic? Is it a silicone-based material that's got more oxygen permeability, more breathability for maybe longer competition? And then we're talking about lubricating agents, right? So some lenses are kind of have a lubricating shield on the front. Some are sort of injected with lubricant. That's kind of what I talk about sometimes with the infused technology from Bausch Lomb with their Pro Balance technology. I always tell athletes it's kind of like injecting the contact lens with Gatorade, right? So you're putting lubricant into the plastic to keep it hydrated for them. So what's the right thing for each individual athlete isn't necessarily always the right thing for that next athlete. So there is a bit of trial and error. You're absolutely right, Fred. And for me, that's kind of spring training. It's pro baseball for me. I have 6 weeks with these athletes a lot of times. So the first time I'm meeting them, this time they're usually drafted. They come to the team, or we just traded for this player in the off season. So I meet them for the first time. It's first day of spring training. We're trying a contact lens, but they're going on the field. Spring training is the perfect time for that. They have a week to go out, catch balls, hit balls, do their thing. The next week I check with them and say, how did it go? How did you feel? What were you seeing? What was it like under the lights? How was the contrast, as you mentioned earlier? And if things don't match up, we have another couple of weeks to kind of tune that up to make sure that by the time they're getting ready to hit 97-mile-an-hour fastballs, we're not guessing whether or not it works. We know it's locked in.
Right.
Well, you also mentioned something that I think is really important, both of you guys. And Fred, you obviously were in industry. You understand this. Is this concept that you have to look at specialty performance if they're doing a very unique visual task. And a lot of times it drives me nuts. So I see kids coming from all over the country into the university setting, and I'm having to deal with whoever it was they were working with previously. And very often I'll even get the parents say, well, just give me the prescription. I'll go buy the cheaper lenses, online, or I can get a different version of this lens for a lot cheaper. And I have to explain it to them. It's like when a new pair of J's drop and the kid wants his new sneaks, you don't go to Payless and just buy something, super cheap, similar, and everyone's going to be fooled and thinking like, wow, those are J's. No, that's not how it works. Like there
are no J's.
That's right. That's exactly right. So it's kind of like this concept that you'll ask the student or the athlete, I'm thinking college, but you ask any of these performance guys, like, do you guys have anything specific just for playing? And they're like, oh yeah, I got cleats, I got pads, I got this. And I'm like, do you wear those to class? And they're like, well, no. And I'm like, exactly. So what we're doing here is we're correcting you for a unique task, and it may not be applicable to other parts of your life. You don't wear high heels to go play tennis. And so a lot of times I will spend a little bit of time telling them that this isn't all the same. It's not all the same. And Keith, you mentioned materials, and I think sometimes we think of that as just a marketing ploy, but it's critically important. Wouldn't you agree?
Yeah, for sure.
With the new materials we have today versus 20 years ago, oh my goodness, it's so fantastic to have some of these effusing materials, etc. So yeah, it's different.
Yeah. I'll tell you, the one thing we touched on a little bit earlier, I'd love to come back around with and talk about is presbyopia in these extreme sports, because it's one of those things. I think Derek just made a good point, where a lot of times I will have an athlete that has a day-to-day lens that they may wear to the office because they're not getting paid to do their extreme sport, right? So they're sitting in an office all day looking at a computer screen, maybe using a multifocal or kind of presbyopic contact lens. We have the infused multifocal, we have the ultra multifocal, we have a lot of different lenses that we can use for them to allow them to see near and far. But I always really, look, I'm honest with my patients. I want them to have the right expectations, and I wear the lens myself. I'm wearing it right now. It is very good, and I tell them it's very good. It's not perfect. And I think there's a certain level of expectations that you have to set and say, look, your vision, will be good enough to get on your computer, look at your phone, drive your car back and forth, and really live your life. But if you're doing an extreme sport, that level of clarity may not be enough. So do they switch from potentially a daily lens, that they're using day to day in the office, and then they have a distance vision only lens that they would use for that extreme sport? So how much does presbyopia come into play with that conversation in motorsports, guys?
A ton. No, you hit it right on the head, Keith. And so, sorry to jump in here, Derek, but
No, let's
I
go.
live this stuff. And so, I'd say probably of my 45 plus clients that I see in my performance clinic that are contact lens wearer, probably half of them, a full half of them, have two different sets of contact lenses. They're presbyopic lens, okay. They're multifocal, they're everyday, and I do a lot of split ads, okay. I do a lot of high lows just to give them that better distance vision in the dominant eye, fit the low. But they may do that for their everyday civilian life, what I call civilian life, and then they are in their hot, full-on distance lens for their sports, okay. And the reason, and so not all of them need that, but quite a few of them do, because again, with a presbyopic correction, sometimes you can't help but compromise at some little bit the contrast sensitivity. That is key, absolutely key, especially, and Derek, you can appreciate this if anybody can, especially in low, dim illumination, poor track conditions, etc. You have to have really, really good contrast sensitivity. And that's why quite often it rules out a presbyopic lens, a multifocal, because it's just by virtue of the optics, it's going to compromise contrast sensitivity a little bit. And sometimes, more often than not, it's going to be significant.
Again, there's variable lenses we have, and Bausch Lomb is one of them, right? With the ultra multifocal for astigmatism, one of the few soft lens technologies we have that marries all that together, right? With a soft lens that corrects near vision, far vision, and astigmatism, which is, a difficult thing to find and a really, unique tool in the marketplace. But, I think we're talking a lot about contact lenses. What do you gentlemen feel about with, protective eyewear or sports eyewear for someone who just can't put a contact lens in their eye? How do you feel about refractive surgery? How does that work, or how do those two things play in the motorsports world, the eyewear phase and the refractive surgery phase?
Well, Derek, you may be a little bit biased, and I may be too. I have worked, so I work a number of different places, not just my sports vision clinic, but I work with a refractive surgeon, give them a half a day or a day a week quite often. I am a proponent for refractive surgery for people that just can't get a contact lens in there, and it's just counter to put glasses on them. I'm very comfortable co-managing refractive surgery for them. Any way that you can get them there. And the other really cool thing about refractive surgery is this is not where it was 15 years ago. We now have the ability to do these custom procedures that we can just absolutely minimize any kind of these higher order aberrations that impact the quality of vision. And so I'm not that concerned about impacting somebody's contrast sensitivity negatively through refractive surgery where we were 20 years ago. So there's an awful lot going in there, but Keith, I don't hesitate with a lot of my clients to suggest refractive surgery.
Derek, you have a different take on that, or how do you feel?
Certainly, for our younger patients, I'm always a proponent. I want contacts. I don't like spectacles, and simply because of peripheral awareness issues and peripheral distortion as well. Now, if they have to wear them, obviously safety is of paramount importance. We'll use, appropriate eyewear that's not commercial eyewear, or that's not basically fashion eyewear. But ultimately, yes, contact lenses. If patient is performing exceptionally well and doing well with contacts, we don't rock the boat. But once they're of adult age and once they're fully grown, given an opportunity, I do like the idea of trying, if they're a candidate, of physically correcting them, simply because it takes away another metric, or basically another possibility of. It's one more refractive plane that I don't need if I don't have to have it. But ultimately, that's not it for everyone. It's expensive, and it's something that you have to be a candidate for, and most people are, but they may not be the right time in their life. So contact lenses are still the mainstay of correction. I think that's why we've been spending our time on it. Glasses are the last choice. We will do it, certainly will do it. And maybe for race car drivers, it's a little bit more applicable, maybe. But every other sport, certainly contact lenses first choice, refractive surgery if you're a candidate, and then spectacles.
Yeah. So an interesting illustration of that is I have a client that I work with that plays with the one of the Arizona teams and baseball. And he had half a diopter, quarter diopter cylinder in one eye, and he was pretty much playing with the other eye. So I fitted him with a contact lens in that one eye just to get those eyes to work together. And this is, you really want to have them binocularly balanced. Okay, it's so critical. And I couldn't find a lens that this kid was going to be comfortable in. Okay, and I think he was kind of Princess and the Pea kind of guy. And so, so it was really difficult to, high level, high expectations. He just was kind of reluctant to do that. Reluctantly, I sent him off for refractive surgery, and we nailed it. Half a diopter, quarter diopter, so nailed it. The kid is beside himself. He just had one procedure done in the one eye, and I don't know if he's the exception, but it's just think creatively. Don't rule out any of these things. And glasses were not an option. We tried contact lenses. We got really good vision with contacts, but he just felt it, and when you feel it, you become distracted and it messes with your head. So,
yeah. So you touched on something there that I'm really curious about, because I know you both, like I said, we go back probably 20 years, you, my friends here on the call, but my understanding, Derek, you do much more street sort of riding, track riding, versus Fred, much more off, road the jumps, the ruts in the dirt and the mud and all these kind of things. The depth perception component that plays into both of those sports. A lot of times we'll get athletes that come to us for the first time, or maybe, like we talked about before, they have a day job and then this is their fun experience on the weekend or whatever, and they come in with monovision, right? So they come in with contact lenses or refractive surgery, for that matter, that was done with one eye for distance vision, one eye for reading vision. As we know, that has significant challenges from a depth perception standpoint. So first of all, is that even acceptable? Is that doable in the two motorsports that you guys both participate in? And if not, how do you correct it?
So yeah, that's a block. Okay. No. So I'll get them out of monovision. And so how I'll correct that is, if I have to, I'll put one contact lens on that eye. Okay. I do a lot of mono fitting, just a single contact lens to bring that mono eye, to bring that near eye back up to the distance, or vice versa. So it's not unheard of to do that. And when you are fitting just a single contact lens to one eye, you have to be really very, very diligent about a good fit. And you want to make that, I want to make that lens invisible to them. I want it invisible, but absolutely critical. Derek, I don't know about you, but I don't have any of my athletes that are doing any of these sports wearing monovision.
No, it's interesting though. There's a big difference between stereo vision and depth perception. And so, for instance, commercial pilots can wear monovision because their depth perception cues are largely monocular. And so you can have a commercial pilot that can land planes very, very well with a monovision setting. But as Fred said, when you're dealing with much closer things that are moving much faster, you need stereo interpretation. You need your depth and stereo working together. And so, this is a great point. Darryl, as we're talking about some of this stuff, there is going to be critical separations between some of the stuff we talked about before and pilots. For instance, the monovision being one of them.
There was a time many years ago, and you remember that, I think there was a case in Texas or something like that, where there was a guy that was fitted with monovision. They were trying to pin the blame of some issue on his monovision, and I think they resolved that it wasn't the monovision. It was like, I don't know what it was,
Right.
Yeah, and that was a neat point though too, Fred. You'll have people that say, look, I'd love to have laser correction or refractive correction. Maybe that's the first time you've met them and they've had monovision done, or they just decided, look, this is how I live 80% or more of my day is sitting at a computer and living a normal everyday life. But, I love to go rip around and have my hair fly off when I'm jumping over jumps on the weekend. So, maybe monovision suits my need for day to day. But, when I get on the track, I could put one contact lens in and all of a sudden my monovision's gone. And I can go live my life's passion and not kill myself, right, Fred?
Oh, absolutely. I got wakeboarders and snowboarders and skiers, etc. that basically they've got a lens for one of their eyes. And when they go do their crazy stuff or their sport or what have you, they just put that lens in for 2 hours, 4 hours, whatever, do their sport, knock themselves out, whatever, take the lens out, and there they are. They're back to their civilian setup. So
yeah,
absolutely.
Love it.
Well, fellas, this has been fantastic. I've learned so much. You guys are the experts, right? I'm your primary care doctor. So when it comes into, sports, dynamic vision, and motocross, riding different terrains, different eye movements, sometimes I get a little lost in what I'm supposed to do. But now I see when these contact lens companies come out, the material that they put out is not just for marketing. It is actually something that can help to put you in the right direction to fit that patient that may have that dynamic vision, that may be looking in different directions. And one thing that I wanted to touch on, I want to read these stats out, and it's all about the Infuse 1 day for astigmatism lens. I was blown away as you gentlemen were talking, and I was reviewing some of these stats that 95% of lenses settle within 30 seconds, within 10 degrees. That is a big deal. So when you're talking about these flips and moving around and looking straight ahead, you want something that's going to really settle fast and remain stable with every blink. Another stat is that it settles within 3 degrees of the ideal orientation. That's almost perfect. I love to see that type of data. And then the last thing I wanted to share was 97% of lenses had less than 3 degrees rotations with every blink. That is game changing. So for all my colleagues out there that are working with patients that come in and they ride motorcycles and they live that fast life, you want to make sure that you really get into the details of what that lens is all about, because that lens can elevate that athlete that's sitting in front of you. But most importantly, that patient's going to be happy. I think it's time to show a little love from our partners over at Bausch Lomb, and then we're going to jump into flying high with the pilot. Let's go.
Bausch Lomb just recently launched their latest innovation, the Infuse for Astigmatism. It's a new toric lens that pushes the limits of stability, clarity, and comfort. The standout feature of this lens is the optic align design, which allows the lens to settle fast and remain stable with each blink. The innovative high-definition optics can minimize spherical aberration and reduce halos and glare, even in low light. And by using the same next-generation material and pro-balance technology as other infused lenses, this lens can provide all-day comfort and minimize contact lens dryness. Plus, with the most in-office parameters compared to other leading brands, Infuse for Astigmatism allows you to fit a wide range of patients. Don't wait. Get out there today and try the Infuse for Astigmatism for your astigmatic patients.
We are now going to jump into a whole new segment, and we're going to talk about what it's about sitting in that cockpit of an airplane, right? But most importantly, helping these pilots to be able to see and take it to the next level. And we have the one and only Dr. Richard Baird here to have this conversation with us today. How are you doing today, sir?
Doing fine, thanks. How about yourself, Darryl?
Hey, doing well. We're super excited to have this conversation with you because we know you have tons of great stories and you've done so much in eye care. So we're super excited to learn a little bit more about all the amazing things that you have done. Now, before we get started too far, we'd love to just give a high-level overview, if you don't mind, of who you are, your background, and how you got into eye care, if you don't mind, my friend.
So the shortest answer is my wife.
Okay.
I joined the Air Force many years ago, about 30 something years ago, and I was working on the flight line, and she couldn't see a future of me, doing that for a long time. So she said, "Dear, why don't we go to optometry school and you can be an eye doctor and that'll be a better thing." And So I was involved in what's called the POW MIA mission, so prisoner of war missing in action mission. And that entailed we'd go to different countries throughout the world, searching for anybody who might be killed in, the remains of somebody killed in action, or some prisoner of war. There's still reports of prisoners of war in places like China and Vietnam and North Korea. And I had come home from one of those missions, and she said, we're going to Maui, because we were based out of Hawaii, and went to Maui and walked in, and there was a guy with hair down to his waist, and he was talking about why baseball players miss the ball. And I thought, what? You can be an eye doctor and work with baseball players? Sign me up. And so I was hooked, and I finished my commitment with the POW-MI mission, and then got out of the Air Force for a couple of years and went back and took the prerequisite classes, and then went to optometry school. And 2 or 3 years later, the guy with the long hair was one of my professors. So that's kind of how I got started. I have been in the Air Force, practicing in the Air Force, and as you know, the Air Force deals with a lot of planes. There's little fighter jet planes, and there's great big cargo planes and other ones in between. And we also have what we call RPA, remotely piloted aircraft. Other people call them drones, but the RPA people don't like us to use the term drone because they think of drone as something small. And so we work with those operators as well. I don't know how much you want me to talk here about it.
Well, I think we should, continue to lay the foundation. Okay. And I would love for you to maybe set the foundation of what does that cockpit look like, right? So what are the pilots looking at when they're inside of that airplane? I would love for you to kind of paint that picture, because that's going to help us have this conversation in regards to multifocal contact lenses and toric contact lenses to help them see and function at a high level.
Okay. So let's start with the fighter jets. Fighter jets are small. Usually if it's a two-seater, it's a one in front, one in back sort of a thing. And so it's not that much bigger than kind of a large computer screen. And so you're sitting there and you've got just a huge wad of instrumentation, because you've got to know your altitude. You got to know what we call your attitude. You've got to know how much gas you got in the tank. You got to know oil pressure and hundreds of other things. And so there's just a mass of different gauges and dials and things like that. And it's all cramped in, and you don't have much ability to move your chair back and forth, a little bit, but not much. And so when we're trying to correct somebody, we try and be very specific to make sure they can see clearly at that distance, the cockpit distance, and then they've got to be able to see clearly far away. And then there are things like the heads-up display, which is going to display it virtually out in front of you. The new F-35, they have a really cool multi-million-dollar helmet that displays it right inside the helmet. And it's a virtual reality where you can actually look around. You can look under your plane, above your plane, all inside the helmet, which is really cool. But then that requires some pretty high-level optics to work that, so that you can be able to, see clearly, sort of a thing. In the larger planes, the big transport planes, then you've got a lot more room. Still a lot of dials, but more room, things like that. So sometimes in those planes, let me back up. Fighter planes, it's all down here.
Okay.
But in the big ones, you might have a whole set of dials up here, in addition to the stuff down here. And so that is an added concern for the pilot. The RPA or drone, they have multiple computer screens, all about arm's length. The big issue with their work is that they're working sometimes 12 to 14 hours a day, nonstop. And so in that case, we're thinking about dryness, but we're also thinking about dryness in the other, because if you're up high at altitude, then the air is really dry. And so one of the big things we work on is trying to make sure we have good contact lenses, and the BNL ones are really good to try and make sure that the pilot can have, good, comfortable vision while they're flying.
Wow. Keith, Derek, I don't even know where to start with this because now I'm putting together this picture, and I fly a lot for work, and I always walk by, the cockpit, and when I look in there, I just see all these buttons all over the place, and I'm like, man, these buttons are all at different ranges. And then what I hear with Dr. Baird is saying, I'm like, man, that's a lot to unpack and be able to see all at one time to get us to our destination safely. So I'm curious to know, what are these conversations looking like in your exam lanes, and how can we do better when it comes to making sure that our patients can see well?
So, first of all, you probably know that Air Force pilots have to see 20/20, both up close and out in the distance. And I know for our athletes, we like that to be even better, but for pilots, it's set at 20/20. And so with that requirement, then there's two options. You can either, if you have, if you're an emmetropic, then you don't need glasses until you get to be, pre-presbyopic or presbyopic. But then you're either going to wear glasses, or you're going to wear contact lenses. Not everybody wears contact lenses because some of them actually do prefer glasses. But if you're going to do, let's say, night flying, where you're going to wear what we call night vision goggles, then that's kind of hard. Or sometimes if you're wearing in a plane that requires a helmet, it's hard to get comfortable vision if you're wearing glasses in the helmet or in the night vision goggles. And so that's when we start to push really hard. I push contacts all the time, but especially in those situations, then we're going to push contact lenses.
All right, Richard, I want to jump in on this for a second because I think there's a distinction or some clarity here that can help a lot of us because we deal with civilian people that may be interested in the Air Force. As far as high fast goes, are they allowed to wear contact lenses or just BCGs when they are in high fast?
You can wear a contact lens in any airframe.
Okay, so that includes an F-35, that includes anything. Okay. Now, when it comes to contact lenses, who's being tasked to fit those? Is it always an Air Force guy, or is civilians ever tasked to do that in, let's say, reserve situations or in guard situations?
Ideally, the Air Force doc who knows all of the requirements will fit them. If there are some cases, and that's a really good point, Derek, that sometimes in guard or in reserve situations, there may be a civilian, but then an Air Force doc has to kind of provide oversight and say, yeah, that's an approved contact lens.
Correct me if I'm wrong, the Air Force has different requirements than the Navy, than the Army, correct?
Yeah, a little bit. So the Air Force is the most stringent.
Okay.
Navy is less, and Army is less.
That comes from an Air Force guy. That's what I expected. Now, all right. Now, one last thing that I want to get into, and because you touched on this earlier, and I think this plays well into our conversation here. We were talking about athletes in the extreme environments that they go in, and a lot of people that haven't, I guess, a lot of people that have only periodically or never flown in an unpressurized cabin don't really understand the stress that your eye goes through. You mentioned it a little bit, but at altitude, especially in unpressurized cabins or even in certain partially pressurized cabins, the drying effect is Darryl, you said when you're on a passenger plane, we all know our eyes can get dry, 10% humidity in a commercial pressurized cabin. These guys that are doing these long flights, whether they're on a C-130 or whether, they're in a, high fast plane, how much do you think about that when you're going through a regular eye exam? And then how much do you think about the materials, saying, okay, well, I know there's approved materials, but this guy's going to be under an extra amount of stress. This is what goes into my thinking when I'm, let's say, going to fit him with a contact lens.
So I try and pay a lot of attention to it, because I know that if they dry out, it could affect the mission. And so they do have to take their glasses with them so that if something happens, then they can pull their contacts out and put their glasses on. But we try and get the very best contacts, the best water content, and combination and things like that, so that the pilots can have that comfortable vision throughout the whole mission. Let me jump in on one thing that you talked about, because especially with high fast, and let's tie this in a little bit with athletes. If you're in a big plane, you're just sitting there, maybe get up and walk around, stuff like that. If you're flying an RPA, you're just sitting there. But if you're high fast, you're doing dives, you're doing max vertical takeoff, you're doing loops, you're doing rolls, and especially if you're doing anything that's trying to mimic a wartime scenario. And so we try and we'll fit contacts a little bit tight, because I don't want them flopping around if this guy goes into a roll and then loses, his acuity because his contacts slid off to the side, or if he goes into a dive and, it causes everything to go, gets pulled down. I don't want the contacts to get pulled down and then he can't see clearly. So
how much does this play into? Because for some people that don't know, the Air Force actually has athletic teams as well.
Yep.
That's from my Army buddy. I was supposed to say that way. Now, is there a direct correlation when you're working with, let's say, an extreme athlete or an athlete in let's say your sporting events at a collegiate level, and is there the same type of thinking with a pilot? Like, is some of the thought process you're going through with a fighter pilot kind of the same that you might go through with a football player that's in high jarring, high G situations as well, in multiple, vision angles and things of that nature?
No, we think of our Air Force Academy athletes. Pilots are just athletes sitting in a cockpit. And while I would like to take credit for that phrase, it was actually one of our wide receivers that said, yeah, because somebody asked him about, hey, in a couple of years, you're going to be flying a plane. He's like, it's okay, because the same things I'll use in athletics are the same things I'm going to use flying a plane. And then he said, yeah, flying is just an athlete in an airframe.
Well, and let's be honest, some of these pilots are incredibly fit people, and they're actually required to be for some of the jobs that they're doing. Is that not true? That
is. But a lot of our Air Force Academy cadets, they're good athletes. So, for example, the F-22 is considered kind of the coolest plane that we have, and
most expensive.
It's pretty expensive. It's not the most one, because the B-2 is more.
Oh, yeah, you got it. Yeah.
But I think I can't say if it's a majority of the F-22 pilots used to be like Air Force Academy basketball and baseball players, sorts of thing.
Well,
and so this, having that good physical ability and good ability to use their eyes comes in handy when they're trying to fly a really cool plane.
Yeah, talk a little bit about the Human Performance Lab that you were a part of, Richard. I know that was something you spent a long time with, and that's something I think really unique to the Air Force environment, where you had a chance to do a lot of testing, I think, and really cut some pretty exciting research out of that lab that is relevant, to Derek's point, to pilots and sports and athletes alike. Is that accurate?
So it was the coolest job I ever had. We had a lot of really cool equipment, some standardized stuff, SVT and Dynavision, did a lot of strobe work, both in the lab and then out on the field with the different teams. So I take strobes out on the field for football, or down to the baseball diamond, or over at the volleyball gym, stuff like that. We did a lot. We had a couple of other, we had some tachistoscope machines that we used. We had another machine called the gyrostim, which a lot of the athletes really liked. And I don't have a picture to show you that one, but it spins around in multiple directions and multiple meridians. And so they, like, the gymnasts and the divers really liked it because they're spinning around all the time. But other people, like some of the football players, would like it because they said it helped them to really zone in on focusing and stuff like that. Kind of like a strobe specs on steroids. One of the cool experiences I had there in the lab related to the kind of what we're talking about is I noticed that up on the hill, which is where all the classes are, I'd see football players wearing glasses. And then I actually saw a couple of them wearing glasses at practice. And I told them, you can't wear glasses at football practice. And then I saw others that were wearing glasses up on the hill at class, but they weren't wearing any glasses. So I asked them, when did you get your contact lenses checked? And they had never had contact lenses. And so they're trying to play without being able to see very clearly. And so I was really blessed to be able to convince them to come in and try contacts. And interestingly enough, a lot of them had about 2.5 or 3 diopters of SIL. So we put toric contact lenses on them. And then they were just ecstatic because they said, we never knew what we were missing when we get out on the field. And they, last year we did super well.
Yeah, and we were talking a little bit on the previous segment, Richard, about the stability of contact lenses, how important and critical it is for the contact lens selection process, whether it be aspheric lenses, toric lenses, even multifocal lenses, as you've mentioned, some of your presbyopic and presbyopic pilots. But those are all relevant as we go to pilots, right? I mean, you have to figure out the right formulation, if you will, to whether or not that pilot needs the accuracy, the precision of correction, but also maybe a multifocal as well. Those all come into play for you, yeah?
Yeah, so I can't use multifocal.
Okay.
That's a difference between the FAA and the Air Force.
Okay, perfect.
And so FAA, your civilian pilots, they can use multifocal, but Air Force, you can't. And so we would, if they get to the point where they can't see 20/20 up close, then they have to wear a bifocal with 0 and plano in the top and then the add in the bottom. But we would try and work with them. And a lot of times if you give them like a near far rock and have them work out that flexibility of the visual system, we could buy them a year or two before they had to go into the bifocal. But that is one of the key differences between Air Force flying and civilian flying.
Yeah, that's a great point. I'm really glad we got to that. I mean, I think a lot of the people on this podcast, a lot of people that are going to listen to this, Darryl, are going to work with pilots, right? Whether they be recreational pilots or commercial pilots, and obviously taking some of the lessons we're talking about here in thinking about material and stability and sort of the visual ranges that you need, as we talked about in the previous segment, asking that pilot whether they have displays and gauges above, or if they only have displays and gauges below, depending on the type of aircraft they're flying. Is going to be critical to fitting them appropriately, and knowing that you can't use a multifocal maybe in military pilots, but we could with a commercial pilot is something that's a really unique distinction. So I'm glad you brought that up, Richard. Thank you.
Welcome.
Yeah, and I'm assuming some of that, of course, is safety, but also when I think about commercial planes, again, there's so much space that's in there, so you need more ranges to be able to cater to, and that may make life a little easier. Now, I really want to spend a little time on the gazes because, as you mentioned, Keith, earlier, we had someone on that was dealing with motocross, and there's a lot of up and down and moving around and things of that nature. And I know depending on the jet that the pilot is flying, some of that may impact. But when it comes to correcting for astigmatism, can we spend a little time on that, Dr. Baird? Because I feel like I get concerned sometimes with contact lens moving around and throwing vision off. So what kind of conversation are you having with the pilots when they walk into your exam lane in regards to how a lens that corrects for astigmatism works and how it's going to impact their vision?
Yeah. Well, just like you would, my first thing is I'm going to tell them why they need an astigmatic lens, to correct 2 separate meridians. And then we do try and look at, okay, so what kind of plane does this person fly, or what kind of mission do they have? So remember, we talked about, Derek's high and fast, the F-16, which is a pretty famous plane. The pilot is sitting at an angle so that they can look up and around, because they have kind of a bubble cockpit. Okay. And so they're leaning back on an angle, and then when they're looking at their instruments, they're looking in down gaze. So I've got to make sure that they can look in down gaze and still have correction, but also be able to look completely, almost as close to 360 as possible, and then keep that, contact stabilized on their eye so that they will be able to have that clear vision. So I tend to fit contacts a little bit on the tight side. And I know that there's a balance there, because we know that if it's too tight, too long, then it can be uncomfortable. But because of the potential for movement, then meaning movement, both contacts, but also movement in the plane, then with some of those pilots, I will fit them just a little bit tighter than I might otherwise fit.
Yeah, and I think, Richard, you made a good point talking earlier about just the different types of lenses and the families of lenses that you become comfortable with. Obviously, we have a lot of different families of lenses we can utilize, and there's no perfect solution. But I'm also a big believer in the Bausch Lomb family. I think it makes a big difference when you have new generation materials, things like the infused material with these extra injected lubricants sort of injected into the material and the molds, so that you have something that retains that function for longer periods of time. You mentioned the drone pilots. I mean, it's another thing where that lens can't dry out, whether it's an aspheric design, helping them with more higher definition optics, or a toric lens. It has to be a lens that maintains function for longer periods of time than just kind of the average Joe. So I think, thinking about those polymers, thinking about those family of lenses, are for me pretty critical too, whether it be an ultra lens or an infused lens. They're great products that retain a lot of that moisture, which keeps the visual performance consistent, right?
Yeah. And what I like that, because so for example, the Ultra's got a pretty good decay value. And so I'm always a fan of having oxygen, because if we think about it in a flying environment, we're going to have reduced oxygen. And so I want as good a decay value in a lens so that I don't have reduced oxygen from the environment and reduced oxygen from the lens. So like you said, Ultra really good in that particular aspect. We did have a few infused did get approved over the past couple of years. And so we started to see more people going to that lens, and more of us practitioners, asking for the fitting sets and starting to use that to, like you said, to keep that good, comfortable vision.
I'm curious about one other thing that we talked a little bit about, and you were talking about the virtual reality, the kind of head that you have, the pilots with this helmet and the displays and things like that in there. We're seeing a lot of things where there's VR moving into a training environment, where we're getting a lot of athletes that are engaged with virtual reality training. We're using that with a lot of our elite athletes, whether they use, some of the programs that are out there on the Oculus systems, React, Sharp Eye Shootout, some of these kind of training systems that can be used to kind of build in these extra visual skill sets, right? We talk about clarity, we're talking about contact lens stability, but these multiple object tracking, reaction time, kind of peripheral awareness, depth perception kind of components. Those are things that I feel quite confident, training into the VR world. I think we're seeing some great results from that in the sports environment. Have you guys touched base with that at all in the military and talked about it from a combat standpoint as well?
So I'm going to answer that second. Curiously enough, we actually use VR in maintenance. And so I have actually stood inside of a jet engine virtually, and we'll put the Oculus on people, and then say, okay, here's the jet engine, and you can actually go inside and look and see, okay, that's what it looks like inside without taking the whole thing apart. And then, okay, see that fan blade is warped or it's broken, and that's what you got to look for. So we definitely use it in situations for maintenance. We're starting to use it with our security forces so that they can practice those stressful situations without being in a stressful situation. And then there is starting to be some talk with the pilots, but that's we do a lot of the simulators. We did talk about one down at Edwards, because the Oculus was coming up with a little part that you could put behind your ear to actually simulate motion, so that you would actually experience motion. Because right now, most of the simulators are just stationary, because somebody did a study, and if you wanted, I could find it, but somebody did a study that showed that stationary simulators were just as good as motion simulators, even though the pilots would prefer a simulator that actually moves in that particular study. And I personally think someday they'll find out that they messed up. But there is starting to be talk about, okay, let's get some VR, especially if we can actually, get that ear part, the vestibular system hooked in, so that I actually feel like I'm turning when I see the image turning.
Wow, that's fascinating.
Yeah.
Yeah. What I would love to see is us be able to tap into VR a little bit more as eye care professionals. I'm just sitting here imagining if I could go into the environment of each one of my patients that walk through the doors. Imagine going into the cockpit and being able to see all the different dials, all the different buttons, and that pilot saying, this is the area that I have a problem with. I need help here. Then being able to match that problem with the right solution to be able to see clearly and sharply, that's going to be game changing. And I know that's where it's going to go and end up at some point in time, along with maybe mimicking different conditions, whether it's raining, snowing, or whatever it may be. But I think as optometrists, as eye care professionals, we got fun times ahead of us. And I'm just super excited to be able to always be a part of innovative technology, whether it's contact lens like Bausch Lomb, whether it's having conversations like this with amazing rock star colonels here. This is game changing, and I'm super excited to see where it's going to go. Dr. Keith, Dr. Derek, any last words that you want to share in regards to this conversation? And the same with you, Dr. Baird, because this has been very insightful and game changing for me as an optometrist.
I was just going to say, I completely agree, Darryl. This is a game changer. This is something where pilots are, obviously in life and death scenarios and situations every day, whether they be commercial, recreational, or certainly military pilots. So I think really, we all, have a lot of fun talking about athletes and creating visual environments that can help them improve their game. We were hoping for a good win for us this weekend. That didn't happen on the NFL field, but we got next week to look forward to. So we look forward to making subtle differences because it helps us get an extra couple points or an extra couple home runs. But, these are truly life and death situations for these pilots. So I think, all of our colleagues are going to have a chance to interact with pilots. I think these are life lessons that we're going to hopefully carry with us to make a difference. And I think learning those visual performance skills and those visual performance attributes that can be applied to everyday persons that walk into our exam lane tomorrow is really what this is all about. This is what we're passionate about on Sports Vision Pros, is connecting the worlds of sports and vision. And there's, in my mind, nothing more elite than a combat warfighter in an airplane. So, it was just really exciting for me to be able to talk to Richard again today. And, I always enjoy our conversations. He's an amazing person, has had an amazing career in the military, and getting ready to retire. So we're going to wish him a quick little congratulations and thank you for your service to our country, my friend. I couldn't be more privileged to be your friend.
You're very kind.
Thank you for joining us on the Sports Vision Pros Defocus Media podcast. We're here to help you and your patients see better, play better, and level up your games. We hope you learned something new today that will improve the visual performance of a patient that you'll see tomorrow.